All right, so let's jump into something that I know you've been wanting to dig into for a while.
Okay.
Moon landing conspiracy theories.
All right.
You sent me a ton of material on this, and to be honest, I am really fascinated to kind of get into it.
Yeah, it is fascinating how this has sort of lingered for so long.
Yeah,
And I think it speaks to our human nature, that desire to question the official narrative and to look for something deeper.
totally. It's like a real life mystery, but the entire world is the stage. And I know this is sensitive, so we need to just be upfront. We're not here to debunk or endorse any particular theory.
No, think of us as your guides through the arguments and the evidence, and you
Mm.
can make up your own mind.
At the end,
At the end, you'll have a much clearer picture.
okay, so let's start at the beginning then. Where did these theories first take root?
A lot of it can be traced back to a book in 1976 called We Never Went to the Moon,
Yeah.
America's $30 billion Swindle, and that was by Bill Casing.
Okay, intriguing title. What's the story on this casing fellow?
Well, he was a former Navy officer, but his background was in English.
Wait, English. So he wrote a whole book claiming the moon landing was faked, and he wasn't even a scientist.
Not a scientist.
Interesting.
And it gets even more interesting is that he was a technical writer at Rocketdyne,
Okay.
which built the engines for the Saturn V rocket.
Okay, so he was around the space program.
Yeah, so he was around it, but not really in it.
But not really in it.
Okay.
So maybe he had like some inside scoop. What kind of arguments did he make in his book?
Yeah, well, one of his claims was that NASA had calculated the chance of a successful moon landing at something like 0.0017%.
So basically impossible.
Basically, yeah, almost impossible to pull off.
Like a total long shot.
Total long shot.
But we know it happened.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
I mean, his book kind of ignores the mountain of evidence that supports the landings, but he tapped into that skepticism,
Yeah.
And it really did become a foundation for a lot of these arguments that followed.
It's wild to think that a single book could spark such a widespread belief. Were there any other early contributors to these theories?
Well, even before Apollo 11, groups like the Flat Earth Society were circulating those ideas.
Seriously. So before the landing even happened, there were doubts. What was going on back then that would make people so suspicious?
Well, it's important to consider the social climate. It was the post-Watergate era,
Right.
and there was a rise of distrust towards authority.
Yeah.
And combine that with the Cold War and its inherent secrecy,
Right.
and you've got this perfect breeding ground for conspiracy theories.
So it wasn't just about space. It was about this larger shift of how people viewed truth and authority.
Exactly. And that skepticism actually predates the moon landings.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Apollo historian Andrew Chaikin, he points out that these theories were already popping up during the Apollo 8 mission in 1968.
So before anyone had even set foot on the moon.
Yeah.
Wow, I had no idea it went back that far.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've established that these theories were simmering even before the landings, but let's move on to the why. What were the motives behind faking the landings? Why would anyone go through all that trouble?
Well, there's a few recurring themes.
Okay.
One of the biggest revolves around the space race. The Cold War was in full swing.
Right.
The U.S. was under immense pressure to beat the Soviets to the moon.
It was about more than science. It was
Oh.
about national pride,
Oh, yeah.
demonstrating that we were the best
Global stage, yeah.
on a global stage.
Technological superiority.
Yeah, so faking the landings would have been a shortcut to claiming victory?
That's right. However, one very strong counter-argument is from Phil Plait. He's a well-known astronomer.
Okay.
And he says that the Soviets had their own very robust space program
Right.
and sophisticated intelligence network.
Right.
They would jump at the chance to expose any American fakery. That would have been a huge propaganda win for them.
That makes a lot of sense. Plus, didn't the great Soviet encyclopedia, which was under strict government control, report the moon landing as fact?
Yeah, they did.
Which suggests that even the Soviets accepted the landings as genuine.
Right. They had every reason to call that a hoax.
Right.
But they didn't.
Okay, but it's worth noting that there have been some dissenting voices even within Russia.
Yeah.
As recently as 2023, Dmitry Rogozin, the former head of Roscosmos, expressed his own doubts about the moon landings.
That's right.
Interesting. So even in recent years, these theories have found some high-profile supporters.
That's right.
Okay, so we've got that Cold War pressure as a potential motive. Were there any other big reasons that conspiracy theorists put forward for faking the landings?
Well, another common theory revolves around funding and prestige.
Okay.
Some argue that NASA faked the landings to guarantee that they'd keep getting those big government checks.
I can see the logic there. You fake a historic win, you secure your budget, you keep the money rolling in.
Right. Bill Casing, He claimed that the $30 billion allotted for the Apollo program was more than enough to pay off enough people to keep the conspiracy under wraps.
Okay, but there are some holes in that logic. Like
Right.
what?
Think about the intense scrutiny NASA was under after the Apollo 1 fire,
Right.
where 3 astronauts tragically died.
Yeah.
They were under a microscope.
Yeah.
Faking the landings would have been a massive gamble, risking their entire reputation if the truth ever got out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Wouldn't that be way riskier than just actually going to the moon?
Right. And Mary Bennett and David Percy, authors of the book Dark Moon, they argue that NASA wouldn't risk broadcasting the deaths of astronauts on live TV.
Which is an interesting point considering there wasn't actually a live feed during the landing or takeoff of the lunar module
Right, exactly.
because of limitations in the technology at the time.
Yeah, so the argument doesn't really hold up.
When you consider how the missions actually unfolded, okay, so we've got Cold War rivalry and funding as motives. Were there any other major reasons conspiracy theorists point to?
Well, the third big motive is related to the Vietnam War.
Okay.
Some folks claim that the landings were a way to distract from the very unpopular war in Vietnam.
Okay.
It was a way to boost morale and, take people's minds off the conflict.
And U.S. involvement ended around the same time as the Apollo missions.
That's right.
It's an interesting parallel, but didn't NASA actually face budget cuts that led to the cancellation of later Apollo missions?
It did.
So that contradicts the idea that the landings were purely a distraction for the war.
Exactly. The cuts were a direct result of the space race losing its urgency. Your
Yeah.
priorities shifted.
Yeah.
And so the notion that the landings were orchestrated solely as a war propaganda tool, it doesn't quite fit.
Doesn't quite fit. Okay, so we've covered the origins of these moon landing conspiracy theories.
Right.
We've explored some of the motives behind them. Now let's get to the good stuff, the evidence presented by those who believe the landings were faked.
Ah, yes, the evidence.
That's where things get really interesting. A lot of the evidence focuses on anomalies
Yes,
in the photos and films released by NASA.
that's right.
Things like missing stars in the photos, the American flag waving in the, wait a minute, there's no wind on the moon.
Right.
See, this is what I'm talking about.
It's very intriguing.
This is intriguing stuff.
At first glance, it can seem convincing.
It can.
But before we jump to conclusions, let's remember that many of these claims have been debunked by photography experts, both inside and outside of NASA,
Okay.
applying science and logic, not just speculation.
Okay. Are you ready to dig into some of these specific examples?
I am.
All right, let's get to some of those aha moments where those photographic mysteries are unraveled.
Let's do it. Let's start with a classic one, the missing crosshairs.
Okay.
And some of the photos. Conspiracy theorists often point to instances where the crosshairs appear behind objects
Right.
in the images.
Yeah.
And they claim it's evidence of tampering, like something was pasted,
Like it was pasted over the background or something?
the original background, right?
You're right. Those crosshairs should always be in front of everything else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's where a little bit of technical knowledge kind of clears things up.
Okay.
Those cameras used a special glass plate called a Rousseau plate. So
Okay.
it's a window with a grid etched onto it.
Okay.
So you can't physically put anything in front of those lines.
So then how do they end up behind things in the photos?
Well, it turns out it's only visible in copies and scans of the photos,
Okay.
not the original negatives.
Gotcha.
And the culprit is overexposure.
Okay.
When those images are copied or scanned,
Right.
those thin black crosshairs can get washed out by the brighter areas of the image, especially if the photo is overexposed.
Ah, so it's an artifact of the copying process, not some nefarious editing trick.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about instances where the crosshairs are rotated or even slightly misplaced?
Yeah.
That seems a bit suspect.
Well, it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
It's just a result of those images being cropped or rotated for publication,
Oh, okay.
to make them look nice, aesthetically pleasing, or to fit a specific layout or whatever.
Oh, so the original unedited photo would have the crosshairs probably properly aligned.
Exactly.
Wow. It's amazing how a simple crop or rotation can fuel a whole conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it really goes to show how important it is to go back to the source material.
Yeah.
And not just rely on what you see circulating online.
For sure.
Okay.
Okay, so what about the lack of stars in the photos?
Oh,
That's a big one, right?
that's a good question.
If they were really on the moon, shouldn't we see a sky full of stars?
It's a good question, and a lot of people ask it, but this is where understanding the science of photography kind of helps us see things a little more clearly.
Okay.
Think about trying to see stars in a brightly lit city.
Right.
The glare from all the lights makes it nearly impossible.
Uh,
Same principle applies to the moon landing photos.
so the lunar surface was too bright to allow the fainter light of stars to show up?
Exactly. Remember those photos were taken during lunar daytime?
Right.
Which means the sun was shining directly on the surface.
Okay.
And because there's no atmosphere on the moon to scatter the sunlight,
Right.
the surface becomes incredibly bright.
Right.
And so the camera settings that they
Yeah.
used to capture those well-lit lunar landscapes just wouldn't have been sensitive enough to pick up the faint light of distant stars.
Okay. That makes sense from a photography standpoint, but didn't some of the astronauts themselves say they didn't recall seeing any stars?
They did,
Yeah.
but it's crucial to understand what they were referring to.
Okay.
Their comments were about naked eye observations during lunar daytime
Okay.
under those specific lighting conditions.
Right.
They weren't saying there were no stars at all.
Gotcha.
In fact, the astronauts did see stars when they used navigation optics
Okay.
and when they were in the moon's shadow where the sunlight wasn't as intense.
Okay. So it's not about the absence of stars, but rather the visibility of stars under those particular circumstances?
Precisely. And we have even more concrete evidence from the Apollo 16 mission.
Okay.
They brought along this special camera called a far ultraviolet camera,
Okay.
and it captured images of Earth and stars from the lunar surface.
Oh, wow.
And get this, those images perfectly match observations from orbiting telescopes
Really?
that were observing the same area of space at the same time.
Wow, that's pretty compelling evidence. Okay, let's tackle another big one, the American flag waving in the breeze.
Right?
Or I guess lack of breeze since there's no air on the moon.
Yeah, the waving flag.
How do we explain that seemingly impossible image?
It's a favorite among conspiracy theorists.
It is.
But like the others, there's a perfectly logical explanation.
Okay.
That flag wasn't actually waving in the wind.
Okay.
Remember, it was mounted on a telescopic pole with a horizontal rod extending from the top
Right.
to keep the flag unfurled.
Okay.
So any movement from the astronauts while setting it up would create the appearance of a rippling flag.
So it's not wind, but the momentum from the astronauts handling the flag that creates that waving effect.
Exactly. And plus, think about how the flag was stored.
Okay.
It was folded up tight
Right.
for the journey.
Right.
So when it's unfurled on the moon, it naturally has ripples and wrinkles in it,
Right.
which can be mistaken for waving in a still photograph.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. But what about the way the flag seems to continue waving even after the astronauts let go?
Well, if you watch the video footage, not just the still photos,
Okay.
you'll see that the flag does vibrate for a bit after being handled,
Okay.
but then it settles and stays still.
Okay.
And this is completely consistent with the laws of physics in a vacuum.
Right.
Without air resistance to dampen the motion.
Yeah.
It takes a while for the flag to stop moving completely.
Okay. There's even a theory that it was indoor fans used to cool down the astronauts that caused the flag to wave.
Right. Indoor fans on the moon.
On the moon. Yeah.
Remember, there's no air to drag on the flag in a vacuum. So fans wouldn't have that kind of effect.
That's true.
Honestly, sometimes you have to step back and ask yourself,
Mm.
does that flag's movement really resemble a flag waving in the wind?
Yeah.
Or is this something else entirely?
Yeah, that's a good point. We can get so caught up in these singular images that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Okay, what about those parallel shadows that people point to as evidence of a single artificial light source like you'd find in a studio, like a
Right.
soundstage or something?
Yeah. Well, this one requires a bit more nuance to explain, you know?
Oh, okay.
The lunar surface isn't just this simple, flat plane.
Right.
It's a complex landscape with hills and craters and all sorts of uneven terrain.
Right.
These variations in the surface can create distortions in how we perceive shadows,
Okay.
making them appear parallel even when they're not.
So it's like an optical illusion caused by the landscape itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that there are multiple sources of light on the moon.
Okay.
You have direct sunlight, of course.
Of course.
But also sunlight reflected from Earth.
Light bouncing off the lunar surface itself,
Mm.
and even reflections from the astronauts in their equipment.
Right.
And to make things even more interesting, lunar dust is highly reflective,
Okay.
and it scatters light in all directions,
Wow.
which further affects how shadows appear.
So it's a lot more complex than just a single spotlight shining down on a soundstage.
Yeah, it really highlights how unique the lunar environment is.
Absolutely. And we haven't even touched on the role of perspective and vanishing points,
Right.
which also come into play when we try to interpret those parallel lines in photographs.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how those seemingly damning photographic anomalies can actually be explained when you factor in the science and the specific conditions on the moon.
Yeah,
It's a good reminder that things aren't always as they appear at first glance.
that's right. It's all about digging deeper and considering the bigger picture.
Right. It's not just about photographs, though, right?
Right.
There are also arguments related to the moon's environment and the very real challenges that it poses to human life and the equipment that we send there.
Absolutely.
Right. Let's talk about those challenges. I know one of the big concerns back then was radiation, specifically the Van Allen radiation belts.
Right.
Didn't people believe that those belts would be lethal
Oh, yeah.
for anyone trying to pass through them?
Yeah, the Van Allen belts were a genuine concern.
Yeah.
And there's still something we have to account for in space travel today.
Okay.
These belts are regions of intense radiation that surround Earth.
Right.
And exposure to high levels of radiation can be incredibly dangerous.
So how did the Apollo astronauts survive their journey through these radiation zones?
Well, it comes down to careful planning and understanding how those belts work.
Okay.
There are two main belts, an inner belt and an outer belt.
Okay.
The inner belt is more dangerous, but the Apollo spacecraft passed through it very quickly,
Okay.
minimizing the exposure time.
So it's like a calculated risk, a quick dash through the danger zone.
Exactly. And the outer belt, while much larger, contains less harmful radiation. Plus, the spacecraft itself was designed with aluminum shielding
Right.
to protect the astronauts from radiation.
Okay.
They also wore dosimeters,
Right.
which are devices that measure radiation exposure, so they could monitor their levels throughout the mission.
Okay. So they took precautions. But what about the film they used for those iconic photos?
Yeah.
Wouldn't radiation have damaged the film and ruined the images?
Well, it's a good question, but the film was stored in metal canisters
Okay.
that helped to block radiation.
Okay.
And plus, there was already precedent for this.
Right.
Previous unmanned missions to the moon, like the Soviet Luna 3,
Right.
they had successfully used film to capture images without significant radiation damage.
Interesting. So radiation, while real concern, was something NASA could plan for and mitigate.
Exactly.
What about the extreme temperatures on the moon?
Yeah.
I've heard some people argue that it's simply too hot for film and equipment to survive on the lunar surface.
That's a common misconception. People imagine the moon's surface baking under the intense heat of the sun.
Right.
But they often overlook a crucial factor, the lack of atmosphere.
Okay.
On Earth, our atmosphere helps transfer heat,
Right.
so temperatures are more evenly distributed.
Right.
But in a vacuum like on the moon, heat transfer occurs primarily through radiation.
So it's not like Earth where the air heats up and everything just bakes.
Right, and NASA was well aware of this.
Okay.
They used reflective coatings and paints to help control the temperature of the equipment.
Like that shiny gold foil they used to wrap the lunar module in.
Exactly. That gold color was specifically chosen to reflect sunlight and help regulate the temperature inside the module.
Okay.
Plus, all the Apollo landings were strategically timed to occur shortly after lunar sunrise,
Oh,
and
okay.
temperatures were less extreme.
So they planned the missions around the lunar day-night cycle to avoid the peak heat.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the environment and working within its limitations.
It's truly mind-boggling, all the things that they had to consider.
Yeah, it really demonstrates the incredible level of planning and engineering that went into these missions.
It's pretty amazing. But we haven't even touched on the arguments that revolve around the people involved in these missions.
That's right.
The human element, so to speak.
That's right. Let's shift gears and explore the claims that focus on the behavior of the astronauts
Okay.
and the supposed vastness of the alleged conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most compelling arguments against the moon landing hoaxes is the sheer number of people involved in the Apollo program.
Okay.
Hundreds of thousands of people working on this project for nearly a decade.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think about. You need astronauts and scientists and engineers and technicians. The list goes on and on.
Right.
And they'd all have to keep quiet about this massive secret.
Exactly. It's a logistical nightmare.
Right.
James Longoski, he's an aerospace engineer.
Okay.
He's actually argued that maintaining a secret of this magnitude would be virtually impossible.
Really?
He says it would be far more difficult than actually going to the moon.
So it's easier to do the real thing than to fake it on such a massive scale.
Right.
That's a pretty compelling point.
It is. And here's another thing to consider. No one directly involved with the Apollo program from NASA or the government has ever come forward with credible evidence that the landings were faked.
It makes you wonder, If it were a hoax, wouldn't someone have spilled the beans by now?
Right.
Someone would have that tell-all book or documentary.
Yeah, you would think so.
Right.
And physicist David Robert Grimes, he's even gone a step further and calculated how long a conspiracy of this scale could realistically last before being exposed.
Oh, wow.
And he based his calculations on data from actual historical conspiracies.
So how long could you keep a lid on a secret like this before someone cracks?
His findings suggest that a conspiracy as large as the alleged moon landing hoax would have unraveled within about 3.68 years.
Wow, that's a lot shorter than the decades that have passed since the Apollo mission.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the numbers, but what about the people at the heart of the astronauts themselves?
Right?
Some people point to footage from the Apollo 11 post-flight press conference,
Yeah.
where the astronauts appear tired, somber, maybe even a little off.
Right.
They claim this is evidence of guilt.
Right.
They're carrying the weight of a lie.
It's easy to look back at those images and read into their expressions,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to think about what those astronauts had just gone through.
Oh, yeah?
They just returned from an incredibly intense, historic mission,
Right.
a journey to another world and back. Of course, they'd be exhausted,
Right.
maybe even a little shell-shocked.
Yeah.
To say that their demeanor is solely due to guilt, that's just pure speculation.
Right. It's taking a few select moments out of context and ignoring the incredible physical and emotional toll that mission must have taken on them.
Exactly. And plus, many of the astronauts have been incredibly vocal over the years, defending the authenticity of the missions,
Right.
expressing frustration with the persistence of these conspiracy theories.
And let's not forget the tragic deaths of some astronauts, which conspiracy theorists often try to weave into their narratives,
Yeah.
suggesting these deaths were part of a cover-up.
It's a very dark aspect of this whole debate, and it's important to be sensitive to the families of those who lost their lives.
Of course.
But when you look at the facts, most of those deaths were unrelated to the Apollo missions and happened well before the moon landings even took place.
Yeah.
Attributing them to some sort of grand conspiracy simply isn't supported by the evidence.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've explored the origins of these moon landing conspiracy theories, the motives behind them, the photographic evidence, the environmental challenges, and even the human element. What stands out to you the most from all of this information?
For me, the most remarkable thing is this. While the evidence overwhelmingly supports the fact that the moon landings were real, the persistence of these theories really speaks to something deeper about human nature.
It does.
It highlights our tendency to question authority, to seek out alternative explanations, and to try and make sense of complex world-changing events.
That's a really good point. Even if we debunk these specific claims,
Right.
they still spark a larger conversation about how we process information, how we form our beliefs, and how we grapple with events that challenge our understanding of the world.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It raises some really interesting questions. Why are some people so drawn to these alternative narratives?
Yeah.
Is it a distrust of institutions?
Right.
A need for mystery and intrigue? A desire for a more exciting version of history?
Yeah.
I think it's something worth pondering.
It is, absolutely. And if any of our listeners out there want to delve even deeper into the moon landings and explore the evidence for themselves, there are some fantastic resources available. The Moonbase Clavius website is a great place to start, and the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal contains a wealth of primary source material, including photos, videos, and mission transcripts.
I'd also recommend checking out the Mythbusters episode dedicated to debunking moon landing myths.
Oh,
It's a really fun and informative way to explore the science behind some of those claims.
yeah, great suggestion. And remember, it's okay to question, to be curious, to explore different perspectives. The moon landings were a pivotal moment in human history, and they continue to inspire awe and wonder even today. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep looking up at the stars.